Okay, welcome to today's CHDH seminar. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which we're having this seminar, and to acknowledge the elders and traditional knowledge. I'm glad to introduce Damien Mannion, our speaker for today. So Damien is a vision scientist and a data scientist. His PhD was in the vision science area, and he subsequently took a couple of positions in the US, San Francisco, Minnesota, and came back to UNSW, where he was for, I think, roughly a decade.
Close to it, yeah.
Yeah, before coming to join the MDAP at the University of Melbourne. So, among other things, today he'll tell us a bit about the MDAP and how it works, as well as about some of his work on vision and perception. So, glad that you're here, and thank you. Looking forward to your
Excellent. Thanks very much, Charles, for the introduction, and thanks, Charles and Andy, for the invitation, the opportunity to come and talk to you here today. So as Charles mentioned, I'm now working at MDAP, but my background is in perception science, and I do still think of myself as a perception scientist. So I'm glad for the opportunity to be a perception science more formally for this morning. I'm going to talk about some of the research that I did when I was at UNSW, and I've tried to focus on some aspects that you, as members of the Human Data Hub, might find sort of particularly relevant, particularly interesting. Before I get into that, I just want to talk a little bit about MDAP. So MDAP is a diverse team of academic specialists enabling data-intensive, data-informed and collaborative research across the University of Melbourne. So basically what we are is we're a bunch of academics who have some domain expertise in particular areas, so a really broad range of areas actually, but we've got this sort of shared interest and expertise in things like computation and data and sort of research methods. And what we do is we sort of collaborate with researchers across the university. So we do this in sort of three main ways. Firstly, we have probably the main ways through these faculty supported collaboration scheme. So every year we run an open merit-based allocation scheme, so like a grant basically, where researchers can engage with us for 3 to 9 months with the costs covered by their faculty. So for a few examples, at the moment I'm working on some of these collaborations with people from the Florey, doing some image analysis of wearable eye tracker videos, working with some people in geography, doing some deep neural network modeling of geospatial data, and what might be close to the hearts of some of you is working with research from optometry on implementing a reaction time model in R and developing a web platform for that as well. So I'd encourage you to have a think about, maybe have a little investigation of this scheme and consider sort of applying for that for next year. So that process is actually open at the moment. It's also a funded engagement stream. So if you've got some sort of grant money available, you can sort of work with us on a paid basis. And also just in generally sort of informal advice and short projects. So sort of given our kind of shared background, I'd encourage you to feel free to contact me whenever you like, if you have any sort of questions around research data, research computation, coding, those sorts of things. All right, so oops. Okay, so on to the topic of I'm going to talk about today, and this is going to be around sort of scenes and the components of scenes and how we perceive those using our senses. So I'm going to be using a particular way of representing scene structure that I find really, really useful. And this is my clicker. Yeah. So this is something that looks like this. It's a sort of a way of representing the scene and the information we have available to our senses through sort of a hierarchical graph representation. So if we start down the bottom here, we've got the information that, or the signals that are available to our sensory receptors. So we might have some, things that are available to our eyes. We might have some things that are available to our tactile measurements. And then we think about, well, how are these signals generated from the structure of the environment, the structure of the world? So we might think of this in terms of having an overall scene context. And within that scene, we're going to have some constraints about, it's going to have objects of particular classes, and it's going to have kind of an overall environment structure. And within that constraint of the object class, we'll have some constraints around how it's going to be reflecting light and what sort of shape it has. And together, these sort of aspects of the world have implications, consequences for the signals that we have available to our sensory receptors. And now we can think about the job of perception then is to essentially invert these arrows. So now we want to take our measurements from the sensory signals and now infer the properties of the scene, the properties of the world that were responsible for generating these measurements. So I'm going to be interested in understanding and sort of evaluating the flow of information through these particular scene representations, which you can think of as influence graphs. So here's the first example I'm going to talk through, where we've got a scene. The scene is lit by some light source, and we've got an object in that scene. So the object has got a particular reflectance, so it has a particular way that it reflects light, and it has a certain geometry, so a shape. And together, these things influence the visual signal that we have available in our eyes. So the stimulus I'm going to use to sort of investigate our perception within this framework is, it's known as sort of the Craig-O'Brien-Cornsweet illusion. So this is it depicted here. So these dotted lines, so if we think about, if you take a photometer and you measure the luminance at each point along that profile, you'll get a graph sort of showing up like here at the top, where the luminance is sort of decreasing and then a rapid increase and then decreasing again. So what we tend to find perceptually is that rather than seeing this sort of luminance profile, we tend to see one surface that's darker, one surface that's lighter. So for those in the room here, just a sort of blanket message that these projectors tend to destroy most of these illusions. So if you're finding you're not getting what I'm saying people tend to see, don't be surprised by that. So we can think about, well, why might we see it in this way? And one way people have thought about it is to think about it in terms of these scene components we were talking about. So to generate this particular profile, we could have a surface that is flat, so it doesn't have any variation in its orientation. It's got a reflectance profile that is lower on the left side and then higher on the right side. So that would be lower over here and higher over here. And it's got an illumination profile that is decreasing from the left to the right. So the idea is that our perception tends to be sort of more interested in the reflectance profile of the surface, because it's sort of a stable intrinsic property of the surface, and our perception is sort of steered in that direction. So the real interesting contribution by this paper in 1991 by Neil and Kirsten is to sort of think more about, well, what are some other potential interpretations of this, this image in terms of the scene components? So what they argued is that you can get the same luminance profile if now you've got a different scene configuration. So now instead of being a flat surface, you've got these two curved surfaces. So if you've got these two curved surfaces combined with an illumination that is from a light source very far away, you get this illumination profile on the surface. And if that's the case, then this image is actually caused by something that has equal reflectance across the surface. All right. So what they argued then is perception's got a sort of like a competing hypotheses here. You can either have a flat surface with two different reflectance profiles, or you can have a curved surface with the same reflectance profile. And these two things are going to give you the same information at the sensory receptors. So what they were interested in is if we can provide some auxiliary information that tells us something about the 3D shape of the surface, can that then allow us to essentially explain away one of these hypotheses and get support for the other? So the way they did it was if they add contour cues to the surface, so if they add these sort of bounding things that are suggestive of this curve shape, and in that case, we should be able to essentially have support for the curved hypothesis, and we should no longer see the illusion, because now the surface should be equal reflectance. And that's exactly what they found. So they found that once you add cues that are consistent with it being a curved surface, then people perceived the surface as being of uniform reflectance. So what we wanted to do was to look into more detail about what sort of cues might support this inference of 3D shape. So here they use sort of the bounding contour, and we're interested in looking at whether this process is cue invariant, so whether we can use other information that's going to tell us about 3D shape in order to get this inference of reflectance. So what we were interested in is using motion cues. So we wanted to know whether you have some sort of higher order information about the surface geometry from motion. Does that support this effect? So here's our stimuli. So sort of rotated the gradients here, but again, you can see the Craig-O'Brien corn sweet stimulus. And we've got these two sort of patches that we're going to use in our experiment. So one of these has a bit of texture on it, one of them doesn't. So what we can do is if we set the moving one in motion, then the speed gradient is consistent with what you would get from curved surfaces. So if you're able to compute this structure from motion, or we also call it the kinetic depth effect, then you should be able to perceive the surfaces as curved, and that should flow onto your perception of reflectance. And just as a control, we have the other one where just the central patches are moving. So that for the participants in our experiment, their task is to essentially make a relative brightness judgment. So is that little patch on the top or the bottom, which one is subjectively brighter? So our experimental question was, what's the apparent brightness difference between the top and bottom patches, the stimuli that are textured and in motion? So this is the combination that gives us the kinetic depth effect, the 3D structure from motion. Textured but not moving, uniform and moving, and uniform and static. So we manipulated these four conditions between subjects. So I had about 30 in each of these conditions. Mostly because we're a bit worried about sort of carryover effects. So, if you've seen it as a 3D shape, you might continue seeing it as a 3D shape. And here's sort of a representation of one participant's data. So within subjects, we manipulated sort of the location of we have the comparison patch and a reference patch. So the reference patch is always at 35% reflectance. And what we're going to do is make the comparison patch have lower and higher reflectances. And we're going to estimate this PSE, so the point of subjective equality. Basically, what do we need to set the reflectance of the other patch to so it appears to be subjectively of the same brightness? So here's an example where we're varying the reflectance of the comparison patch. We're measuring the proportion of times that they judged this comparison patch to be brighter. And from these trials, we can fit psychometric function and estimate the midpoint, which is the PSE. So we take these 4 PSEs and combine them into one number that basically says how large was their illusory perception of brightness in this situation. We're going to look at the results, something like this. So here is that one number I mentioned. So this is the brightness effect. Don't worry too much about the actual numbers, but 0 means that they perceived the 2 surfaces to be the same brightness. Positive number means that they perceived the 2 surfaces to have different brightness in the direction of the traditional illusion. And here are our 4 conditions. So remember, the textured motion is the one that had that the shape from kinetic depth. And what we found is that, yes, we find that the illusion does get reduced in this situation where you have these 3D, fused as 3D shape coming from motion. So for the others, you can see the nice healthy illusion here that gets reduced, but not abolished in the cases where you have this 3D structure from motion. So I should mention, feel free to raise any questions as we're going. Okay, so what we'd argue then is that we can use the visual signals to inform us of the shape through this kinetic depth effect. That can then flow on to affect how we interpret the reflectance of the object. So we started thinking a little bit more about this, this representation of the scene, and we started to get particularly interested in this light source. So this idea of a light source as a scene component. And we're interested in this notion that if we have multiple pieces of sensory information about the light source, then we can integrate those together to allow us to have a better representation of the lighting. So here in this example, showing how we can integrate the shading cues and the shadow cues in order to gather some understanding of the light source. So what we wanted to do here was to look at the consequences of having multiple of these objects. So can we essentially integrate across multiple objects in order to gather more information about the light source in a scene? So this is the sort of stimulus construction that we used. So we've got sort of a checkerboard table here, and what we did is rendered these little nondescript objects. We called them potatoes. They don't really look potato-like in how they ended up. And we had sort of one, and we could illuminate this scene from a light source at different azimuths. So we reference this to the viewpoint of the camera or the observer. So that would be 0 degrees. And if we sort of swing the light source around to the right, that's sort of positive illumination angles. Swing the light source around to the left, that would be these negative illumination angles. So we manipulate the number of objects in the scene. So now we've got 9, and here we've got 25 objects. So each of these objects has a reflectance, a random reflectance, and also random shape. We also rendered a condition without cast shadows, just to see what the contribution of cast shadows is to this integration process. And you can see it looks, yeah, they look a little bit funny when you don't have cast shadows. They're kind of floating above the surface. And so what our rationale was here is that we can think of each of these individual objects in the image as giving us some noisy estimate of the direction of the light source. Okay, so here, for example, we've got some sort of Gaussian distribution of the noise. So every time exposure to each item, we have some sort of noisy measurement of the light source direction. And the idea is as we have more and more objects, then we can have more and more of these noisy estimates, which when we pull them together, we can have an estimate of the light source azimuth that has sort of increasingly narrow distribution. So what we wanted to ask them is, what's the precision with which we can discriminate leftwards and rightwards illumination for stimuli with 1, 9, or 25 objects, and whether they have the presence or absence of cast shadows. Now what we did was measure the spread of the psychometric function. We had 28 observers in this experiment. So the prediction is that if we're able to incorporate information about the light source from these multiple objects, then the spread of the psychometric function should decrease as we increase the number of objects. So just to explain a little bit more about what I mean by the spread of the psychometric function. So this is just some data from one participant, one condition. So what we're varying is this angle of illumination in the scene, and we're measuring the proportion of times that they judged that the scene was illuminated from the right of their viewpoint. So these green circles are kind of the measured proportions in a set of bins. And what we're showing here is the fitted psychometric function, and the spread is essentially the inverse slope of this function. So now what we're going to look at is, well, how does this spread change as a function of the number of objects that are visible in the scene? So on the vertical axis here, we've got the spread of the psychometric function. So on the right is in linear space, on the left is in log space. So as you get higher on the vertical axis, that means you're getting worse sensitivity. So our prediction would be that we should have a sort of a decreasing slope as we increase the number of items here. Because say with 25 items, you should be able to integrate lots of that information together, you should be able to do the task better. That'll translate to a more precise psychometric function. That's not what we found. So the first thing to jump out here is that, yeah, there's a huge difference between having these cast shadows and not having cast shadows, which kind of makes sense. But the interesting part is we're not seeing a decrease in the spreads with increasing number of objects. If anything, we're actually seeing the opposite. So if we look at this sort of more formally and look at the posterior distribution of a parameter that's measuring how the spread changes with this linear change in the number of visible objects rank, we can sort of see that it does actually seem to be increasing a little bit alongside this huge difference in the cast shadows versus no cast shadows effect. So it seems like potentially we're not able to do this integration, or potentially there's something else going on that we haven't considered. So to look into that second possibility, that there's something going on we haven't considered, what we were thinking is that the prediction kind of assumed that as we increase the number of objects, we're not really going to change the level of noisiness for any one particular object. But if that assumption is violated, then we get some varying effects. And it kind of makes sense that assumption might be violated. So if you know things like visual crowding, so if you've got more objects, you're going to have objects in the periphery. So those objects might not have the same level of sort of perceptual fidelity that objects close to fixation have. So it's quite possible that we would have a change in sort of the internal noise with increasing number of objects. And we can run some simulations to just see what sort of effects that might have. So here, what I'm showing is the same graph structure that I had on the previous one. And now what I'm doing is, so say in diamonds here, this was our original expectation that the level of internal noise is going to be consistent across the number of visible objects. And you can see we get that decrease in the spread that was motivating our experiment. But if we have situations like here in the circles, if we have the internal noise increases proportional to the number of objects, then we get this flat function. And if it's actually outweighs the benefits of integration, then we can actually see worse performance with the increasing number of objects. So the real key point here is that we've got these two things contributing to the data that we've measured so far, and depending on how those two things trade off against one another, then we're going to see sort of effects in the spread that are difficult to interpret. So what we wanted to do was to try and find a way of disentangling these two contributions, so the internal noise and the number of integrated items. So what we turned to was this approach or this model called equivalent noise. So this is something that I think emerged sort of out of the electrical engineering literature and was used a lot back in sort of the early ideal observer literature, and more so in the early 2000s by Stephen Dakin and colleagues across a number of studies. And it is sort of designed to do that exact thing that we wanted to be able to do, to separate out the contributions of internal noise and the number of integrated objects. And the real key to this approach is the introduction of external noise into the stimulus. So what we're doing in this approach is modeling the spread of the psychometric function as being affected by the internal noise and the number of integrated items, just like we were doing before. But now we've added this extra term where we're introducing some external noise into the model. So how does this help us? So this is a bit of a complicated graph, but let me talk you through it. So this is some simulations just showing you how the model behaves with different parameter values. So on the horizontal axis here, we've got this external noise that we're imposing onto the stimulus. On the vertical axis, we've got our spread of the psychometric function. So this is what we're measuring. And if we start with this, this purple solid line here, so this is simulating the case where we're only using one item and we've got 5 degrees of internal noise. So what this shows you here is how the spread of the psychometric function is going to be affected as we include more and more external noise into the stimulus. So now we can think about, well, what happens if the internal noise changes? So now if we go from the solid purple line to the dashed purple line, this is when we're doubling the amount of internal noise. And you can see that we have a large effect at low levels of external noise. But as we get up to these high levels of external noise, that change in internal noise really gets swamped. So it has negligible effect once we're adding so much external noise to the stimulus. But if you now change the number of items that are integrated, so now we're changing from purple to these blue and greeny colors, you can see that it has a consequence across the range of external noise levels. So even at these very high external noise levels, as you go from 1 item to 3 items to 5 items, you're expecting to see some consequence of that in the psychometric function spread. So why that's useful is that we can now dissociate these two things. So by measuring multiple external noise levels, we can separate out the contributions of internal noise and the number of integrated samples. But how can we introduce external noise into our stimulus? So the way that we sort of decided to do this is to firstly break up our sort of checkerboard and objects such that each has its own little spatial window. And now what we can do is make each object now illuminated from a direction that's drawn from some distribution. So imagine here, I think the true generating distribution was a normal distribution with a standard deviation of about 64 degrees. So now every object here is going to be illuminated from a draw from that distribution. So you've got some external noise there, and the observer's task is to essentially do some averaging over these elements and produce a single estimate of, is this illuminated from the left or from the right? So there are a lot of sort of, less desirable aspects about this. Does introduce a lot of sort of complications and, perceptual sort of interpretation challenges. But I think it's a nice sort of technique to throw into the mix. So again, just to give you a feel for what the raw data was looking like. So here we've got some trials where there's no external noise. Same idea as before. We vary the illumination angle from the left or the right. We measure the proportion of times they're judging left or right. And from that, we get a spread of the psychometric function. And then we also have trials where we have high levels of external noise. And just note the large difference in the scale here. So we're going from -180 to 180 compared to -20 to 20. And see how we now have to use a sort of a circular form of the psychometric function to account for that wrapping. But now the idea is we have a much broader spread in the psychometric function there, as you would expect as we introduce this external noise. But now what we can do then is now fit our model to this set of data, and we're essentially fitting these two parameters, so the amount of internal noise and the number of integrated items. Here we're looking at the number of integrated items. So on the horizontal axis, we've got our estimate of the number of integrated objects with a set size of 9, and the vertical is a set size of 25. Just highlighted this value here. This is where it's square root of n. So there's a lot of literature in the ensemble perception that suggests that when we do this integration, square root of n tends to be the number of objects that we're able to use. What we found here is that we're way down here. So the data that we collected are consistent with participants basically not really doing any spatial integration at all. So relying on essentially one, maybe two objects in order to do the experiment, do the task. So it seems like people aren't really able to incorporate this information across the scene in order to make this judgment about light source direction. And this is actually sort of consistent with some other literature that's sort of found that we're actually not very sensitive to illumination inconsistencies in images. So if you sort of doctor, manipulate an image so that one part of it's lit from a completely different direction, we actually find that surprisingly difficult to detect. And sort of consistent with that idea that we're not really trying to form a global scene level representation of the lighting in an image. And here's just the other side of it, the internal noise. So with this stimulus, we're basically finding that the internal noise is essentially the same across the 9 and the 25 items. So I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but just briefly to mention that we ran a sort of a final experiment in this series where we were looking at You know, what about if you're doing an implicit judgment? So here people did a shape discrimination task where if you're able to, you know, better understand the light source, you should be able to better perceive the shape of an object. And again, we found that there was no evidence of any spatial integration to improve your estimate of the light source. So as we summarize this sort of section, we found that, yeah, we can use the visual estimate of shape through kinetic depth to inform our perception of reflectance. But it seems like we have this limited capacity to integrate across multiple objects to gain some information about the light source. All right, so now I want to switch gears a little bit and look at a bit of take a bit of a multi-sensory perspective on this scene construction. So we're going to think about sound and a sound source, the environment. So at the moment, I'm a sound source. I'm at a particular distance, just from those in the room. I'm speaking at a particular level, probably not loud enough if history is anything to go on. And together, those have some consequences for the auditory signals you're getting at the ear. So what we're particularly interested in here is that many of these things also have consequences for your visual signals. So again, for those in the room, visually, you can get a sense of how far away I am. Visually, you can get a sense of how loud I'm speaking. And you can also get a sense of sort of what we're calling here the sound field. So the broader environment that we're in, that's also affecting the signals you get at the ears. So I'm not going to talk about this first part in any detail. I just want to quickly go through some work we did looking at the visual understanding of distance. So what we did was develop some renderings like this, where sort of positioning the participant looking out on a field, we've got a loudspeaker at a particular distance. It's able to produce a sound with a particular intensity. Now we can manipulate the distance of this loudspeaker. So we've brought it closer and we've brought it further away. So now, if you think about the auditory signals, if you've got a sound with a particular intensity from the loudspeaker at this distance, if you keep that intensity constant and you move it further away, then at the ear, you're going to have a much reduced auditory level. So if you want to understand the intrinsic capacity of this thing to produce sound, then you need to somehow be able to sort of disambiguate those potential contributions. So is something producing more acoustic energy, or is it just closer to me? So what we thought is, well, vision's perfect for this. Vision is great for telling us, how far away. Well, maybe not great, but a lot better than audition for telling us how far away something is. So can we use this visual knowledge in order to change our perception of loudness? Across a whole variety of studies, we would essentially argue it doesn't seem like it. So we've sort of done a lot of different sounds, different environments, echoic, non-echoic, and we really find very little influence of the visual cues to the sound source distance. So the other side of this we wanted to look at is to look at the visual depiction of the sound source level. So here we had an actor here clapping. And here they would look at a particular depiction. And we had the actor do a more vigorous clap. Now, the information at the ear is identical, those two particular situations. So stop that. So the question is, does seeing someone produce a more vigorous clap affect how you're perceiving sort of the loudness of its action? And we found with some EEG approaches that, from the earliest levels of the auditory response, we do see an effect of the apparent vigor from vision in these amplitudes. We also had a look at this psychophysically, and we do have some sort of suggestive evidence that this is the case behaviorally as well. I say suggestive because it's kind of tricky to do this. It's very hard to get around response biases with this sort of stuff. So we had to do quite a complex psychophysical paradigm. I think we gave it a good shot, but probably not quite there for me to be completely confident that we found a sort of robust or reliable effect there. So what I want to talk more about in this particular sort of scene construction arrangement is this idea of the sound field. So the more sort of broader global sense of the world that is also affecting the acoustic energy at the ear. So if you imagine that, you know, as I'm talking, the sound waves are being bounced off the walls, and, you know, depending on the geometry of the room, the material properties of the surfaces, that's going to affect the signals that are at your ear. So the question is, can sort of a visual knowledge of these sound field contributions, can that affect our perception of sound sources? So what we used here was this library that's made available by this guy called the Echo Thief. So what he does is goes around to sort of real world locations and takes a sort of a panorama of that location, so you get to know what it's like visually. And they also measure this called impulse response. So basically, this characterizes how sound propagates in environment. So here, for example, this would be in response to something like a clap. You measure how the sound energy decays over time. So here you can see this measure here, this broadband RT60. This is the reverberation time. So how long does it take for something like a clap to decrease by 60 decibels? So this, you can see that the reverberation time for this tunnel, a bit hard to perceive in this spherical camera, but it's a tunnel, is longer than for this room. So what we did, we used a bunch of these environments. So we had 10 in total, trying to spanning a variety of different geometries, material characteristics. Some are indoor, some are outdoor, and so on. And what we wanted to know was, well, can we associate that a sound is produced in a particular environment with a visual depiction of that environment? So can we hear something and judge whether or whether not it was produced in that environment? So we had those 10 environments. Each of them has the auditory impulse response and also this visual panorama. So we had presented people with a speech sample and a visual depiction for each pairwise combination of these 10 environments. So you can imagine we've got basically 10 times when what you hear and what you see are congruent, so in the same locations, and then the other 90 are cases where what you hear was produced in a different environment to the one you're currently seeing. And what we asked them was the speech sample recorded in the visual environment that you saw? So we were keen on sort of doing this in an immersive context. So we developed this in a VR environment. So the task would we impose this little red object into this scene, this one here, and to get that triggered the playback of the sound, people sort of navigated to find that object. So just give an example. So just heads up that if you're sensitive to sort of full feet or full head motion in video, maybe look away. So this is in the VR, have people kind of looking around the scene. And because in VR, we don't want them sort of turning their head all the way around, so they use the hand controller to sort of flick through the different perspectives. So that was really fun getting this set up. And then, of course, COVID sort of scuttled all those plans. So we had to regroup. And what we decided was to essentially do the exact same thing, but now through a web-based platform. So we had in a browser kind of a first-person perspective when they navigated using the mouse. So here I'll show you an example of that. The same idea, finding this. That's the sort of the sound they would hear, and they asked to make the judgment of, was that produced in the environment that you saw? Let's see if we do a few examples. I hope nobody asked for the right answer because I can't remember. And this was the tunnel we saw earlier. Okay, and what did we find? So here I'm showing the proportion of times that they said, yep, those two things match. And what I'm highlighting in the two conditions here, trials where it's incongruent, so when they don't match, and when they do match is congruent. So the dots are the empirical average. The histograms show the posterior distributions of the estimate of the corresponding statistical parameter. And the key point is that, yes, people do seem to have some sensitivity to this. So when the audio is actually congruent with the vision, they are able to identify that match with a higher proportion than the same match for the incongruent trials. And interestingly, when we compare the ones that were collected in the VR, so this is the head-mounted display, the HMD, there seems to be virtually no difference with when they're running it on the web, which was really good for us because then we could sort of pursue a couple of other experiments using this web platform delivery method. So then we also had a bit of a closer look at these incongruent trials. So then we had 90 trials where they don't match. And what we wanted to look at is the performance on those trials. So you can imagine that if you had an incongruent pairing which actually had quite similar reaction times, then it would make sense for people to confuse those things. So if they are actually pulling out some information about the reverberation time, then if they're very similar, then they should be more likely to say match. If they're dissimilar, should be less likely. And that's what we see in these residuals. So here I'm sort of showing the reverberation time difference in these incongruent trials. And here, basically, if positive, then more likely to have said that they were matching. So as they've got a very small difference in absolute reverberation time, they're more likely, get less likely as you get further away. There's a lot of spread here and scatter and things like that. Seems like there is a general tendency to sort of be pulling out this information and using that to make their judgments. Okay, so that's sort of the things we're interested in looking at the sound field. So we then went on to have a look at, well, what might the consequences of this be, this understanding? Does that help us with things like speech intelligibility? Doesn't seem like it in our hands, at least. Does it help us with temporal duration estimates? Again, doesn't really seem like it in our hands. So I think the functional use of this capacity, I think, is still a little bit uncertain. All right, so just to wrap up what I've talked about today. So the overall sort of aim of this research is to measure human performance on behavioural tasks for scenes with components in meaningful contextual arrangement. And what I've described is some effects that are both consistent and inconsistent with the expectations that we get from these generative considerations. So how we get brightness altered by shape and kinetic depth, but there didn't seem to be much effect on the number of object exemplars on their ability to estimate the light source azimuth. We also talked briefly about there being not much of an effect of visual depictions on sound source distance on loudness, potentially a change in loudness by seeing the sound source level. We saw there's some capacity to relate the appearance and the acoustics of sound fields. But as I briefly mentioned, we don't really see much evidence of the visual depiction of the sound field affecting our ability to identify speech and reverberation. So just a few thoughts on the future directions of this sort of research. Of course, this is all easy to say now that I'm no longer an active researcher in this field, but I think the eventual goal is to have some sort of a theoretical prediction and rationale for the magnitude of the contextual effects. So given one of these seeing graph constructions, which pathways do we think the perception will be able to capitalize on, which ones won't they be capitalizing on, and why? And what I think this needs is more sort of rigorous computational modeling of the available information of the sort that you all do expertly. And I think we need lots and lots of more experimental studies across a variety of domains and modalities. And critically, I think we can't lose sight of, sorry for that pun, but we can't lose sight of the fact that most of these experiments are being run in simulated conditions. So there's always the question of, what are we missing by not doing these things in the real world? And I think it's a really interesting sort of applied question of, what's the best way to build a research program that's able to both get the sort of the feasibility and scope that we have from lab or web-based experiments, but have them informed and checked with real world tests as well. That's a hard question, but I think a really important one. Okay, so I just want to quickly finish by saying that, if you're interested in any of the code and data for this stuff, I've got it all up on this website, CodeOcean, which has the data, the code, and it also has a computational platform where you can just sort of click run or download it, and all the stuff's all together. Quickly acknowledge this all software that I've used here. So again, in terms of engaging with MDAP, if any of this software seems like something you might be interested in incorporating in your own research, please feel free to get in contact and we can talk about it more. And just some personal acknowledgements. So Lindsay Peterson was a PhD student on the illumination work, which was done in collaboration with Dan Kirsten. And Michael Betancourt provided some stats advice, and ARC provided some funding. And Sol Liebersman was a PhD student on the loudness work under supervision from Tom Whitford and I. Graduated during COVID, explains the acknowledgement of the distancing at that time. And Kevin Jang and the Echo Thief were, Kevin was the PhD student on the sound field work, and Echo Thief was the one who produced all that great stimuli for us to use. All right, so thanks everyone for listening, and happy to take any questions.
You mind using that?
Thank you. Thanks so much for the talk. I really liked the last experiment, especially the Echo Thief. And I have a few questions about that. So I was wondering whether there might be individual differences in, people have trained in music or architecture, like maybe they would be better at doing the mapping. And then the other question, how do I frame this? So I don't know about this, but I imagine that there is a way of mapping space to how it sounds like. And in a way, our brain might be doing some sort of, machine learning algorithm to think about what is the feature of the space that map onto some aspect of the feature of the sound. And I don't know whether this is possible to do, but I think it would be really interesting to see for the people that do it well, what is it that they're using to map onto the sound, and does that compare? How does that compare to the presumably what people learn in architecture for what is the correct way of designing these spaces for making the sound sound like whatever we want. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
Thanks for those questions, Marla. The first, the individual differences question. People have sort of looked at things like music and architecture. I think I have tended to find some small effects. In our experiment, we did collect some demographics like that, but it was sort of the conventional first year sample, so we didn't really have much sort of spread along that. So I don't think we can really confidently say very much. But yeah, I would expect that sort of having some training about sort of explicit understanding of how sound propagates in a room probably would help you, particularly in this sort of explicit judgment task. It'd be interesting to know how much would affect an implicit judgment task. And the second question about the information in the scenes. Yeah, it's something we sort of always have that tension of, do you start with the real scene and sort of drill down to the aspects of interest, or do you just start with the low-level aspects of interest and then build up to the naturalistic scene? I would like to do both. So yeah, there are certain sort of equations that will give you information as a function of the sort of geometry of the room and its reflectance. So it'd be interesting to do a very controlled experiment on that and look at how people are able to extract those different parameters. And in terms of the individual differences with specific scenes, we didn't really look into that in too much detail, but what we did look at is variation among the scenes themselves. So which of the scenes are people better at saying match for and which not? And there were some quite interesting aspects. One that I particularly I'll just briefly mention is, once I can find it, is so this number 9 here in particular. So people, I think an interesting aspect of that one was that, so it's basically this enclosed barbecue area space, but it's really ambiguous about whether these things here are glass or just opening. So I think if you interpret it as glass, then that's going to have very different consequences for how you interpret the sound versus if you interpret that as sort of an open area, it's not going to bounce back off. So we did see some individual variation across these scenes that, I think can investigate it to sort of pull out those sort of features of animation.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. That was really interesting. I was wondering if the effect of the number of objects with respect to the light sources, right?
Yep.
That is anything to do with attention. Like it kind of reminds me of I don't know what it's called, but it's kind of like Kahneman's sample size theory of attention or something like that, where the idea is you have a limited capacity of attention, and you have neurons or populations of neurons that have to be spread out across the central scene that they're kind of samplers. So if you have to divide this attention over more objects, then you get sort of noisier estimates. So does it have anything? Could that be any sometimes?
Yeah, it's a very excellent question. So it's the the kind of thing that we thought might have motivated the difference in the potential difference in internal noise as a function of set size is having to distribute that attention broadly. But I think in general we were sort of thinking of this as more of a, if we're going to use it in the real world, as something that needs to be able to aggregate across space without needing any conscious control over the relevant elements. So we actually presented these for quite a short time. I think they were only on screen for maybe 600 milliseconds, I want to say. So not long enough for people to sort of make multiple fixations and try and develop a strategy where they can try and manipulate their attention to sample in particular ways over time. So really, it's really just sort of a one shot. What's sort of our global ability to integrate across signals here.
Okay, we're afternoon. Can I suggest that other people have questions, please come up and catch Damien at the end here. So can we take Damien one more time?
Thanks very much, everybody.